supportive housing is a different sort of messaging in terms of how it's operated. But what ultimately won the day was the math. At the time, this is like 2010, 11, 12, 13. In Northeast Ohio, a chronically homeless individual was costing the taxpayer about $26,000, $27,000 a year, if I recall, in emergency services, shelter stays, a psychiatric hospital, it's emergency room visits, whatever sort of safety nets existed to provide for these people. That's how much it was costing. But I could house them, operate a building, and provide the necessary services on site to keep them, to provide the stability they needed for $15,000 a year in taxpayer money.
In order for permanent supportive housing to work, right, what have you seen in terms of services that are actually effective?
Generally, I think we had one full-time case manager for every, say, 12 to 15 residents. And so typical buildings, 60 to 70 units, you'd have about 4, 5 full-time case managers. And then there would be one sort of manager of those case managers who would sort of understand the whole population of the building. They really have to be sort of cross-trained in a number of disciplines because no two people have the same set of circumstances or the same challenges, right? And that's sort of the first safety net. But chronically homeless also typically don't have jobs. Their only income might be Social Security, or they may not even be receiving it. So we would have an employment specialist who would start at the very basic, like, let's get you up for disability or let's set you up for Social Security. And if you are interested in working and you are stabilized enough to step out and do that, then this person would help them find employers who had the need to hire them and would hire them, but they also would work with the employers to understand the needs of the individual. And so there was a liaison between employer and resident of our building who wanted to work. They got a grant from the state of Ohio to basically operate a mobile health clinic that could come to our buildings, right? And the issue was a lot of these residents, if they had to get on a bus and make more than one bus line change, it was really difficult for them to get to a destination. So we were bringing healthcare to the buildings where there was more comfort and more confidence in the residents utilizing it. Property management is very critical as well because you have to understand the population. And people think like, oh, the homeless are going to come and they're going to bring crime. The way that actually works is that the crime preys on them. So the dope dealers, the people who prey on the most vulnerable, if they know that there's 70 of these residents in the building, you better believe that they're going to come to that block. So we had 24-hour, 7-day-a-week front desk security. Buildings were all highly secured and cameras going up and down the block, every conceivable angle. That kept those negative elements away. But what it also did was every time there was a traffic accident or maybe there was a mugging or something like that, district police were using our tape to help them figure out what went on or to create a case. So they were in our buildings. Well, inevitably, the residents start talking to the officers. And then suddenly we're holding district police meetings in our buildings in the community room. And then you have something that didn't exist before, and that is trust between this population and those who are supposed to serve and protect it.
Welcome to another episode of Affordable Housing and Real Estate Investing. Guys, I'm pumped for today's conversation. I first talked to Brian on the phone, and when he was telling me of all his experience, not just his kind heart of giving back nowadays and teaching other folks how to become a developer, but when he told me about some of the problems he was able to solve, like ending chronic homelessness or being part of those projects, it's amazing that someone is out there not just talking the talk, but actually walking the walk. So, Mr. Brian Drobnick, welcome to the show, man. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, and thank you for having me. This is an honor.
Man, this is an honor for me because, like I told you, you've been so flexible and you've really been accommodating and you believe in the mission so much. And Brian, I'm just so grateful for you being on this podcast today. But for people that don't know your story, Brian, who's Brian? How'd you even get into real estate development?
Well, I was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. And I think this may be a common denominator amongst people who come from Rust Belt cities, but you grow up hearing a lot of negativity about the built environment that you call home. Job loss, poverty, crumbling infrastructure, things like that. And so, like a lot of my peers, I have sort of an innate desire to improve that. And so after undergraduate, I thought for a minute I might want to practice law. I went to law school. I realized 1 month in that I would never practice law a day in my life, and I've held to that promise. But my heart was always back in Cleveland, and what can I do to make it a better place? So after law school, I enrolled in a master's program in urban planning at Cleveland State University. And maybe a year or two after I completed that program, saw a job posting to go work for an affordable housing developer. And I didn't know anything about it, but it seemed to me to be a convergence of policy and planning and real estate development. And so I started, my first position was really doing quality control, the applications for competitive funding and understanding how these deals come together. I then went on to manage projects, develop projects from the ground up in probably, say, about a dozen different states. Over the course of time, I had a period of 4 years or so where I worked for a large nonprofit in Cleveland and was developing permanent supportive housing for the chronically homeless with severe and persistent disability. And that sort of time in my life was when I really awakened to A, the profound need, B, that there is a certain way to go about doing it that I think has better end results for everyone involved. And I left that job, moved on to other things, did some private consulting, relocated to Tennessee in 2021. But along the way, I've always carried that conviction. And so I wouldn't say I set out to be an affordable housing developer. It sort of found me. And these deals are complex, and they're kind of, each one of them is its own wild ride, right? I mean, there are just all these moments that occur where you think, oh my God, is it going to fall apart, or will I get this funding for it? And if not, what do I do? And you get sort of an adrenaline rush from that. And it all comes to conclusion when you close your financing and you start turning dirt, and then you see it manifest as something real.
Wow, what a story, Brian. And just to hear your journey going through all those different stages and really learning from each part of your career, even, right? Let's talk about when you were first a project manager. Did that involve like getting projects approved for entitlements, et cetera?
Yeah, it would start with sort of the pre-development work. So you would figure out what type of deal is going to compete, right? If it's a certain typology or addressing a certain population, if it's in a certain area where there are incentives, and then putting together sort of the preliminary structure of the deal that you then present. And mind you, I'd say almost everything I've ever worked on involved the low-income housing tax credit, either the 9% or the 4%, and sometimes federal historic credits. But there are rules written into the tax code that incentivize where you try to develop and how you develop. And so that work, that sort of pre-development work, all culminates in these immense applications that you submit to state agencies, right, who are sort of the arbiters of the tax credits for the federal government. And then, of course, to local government if you need gap financing. Back in the day, we were submitting 3-ring binders, paper copies, right? You weren't uploading things into portals. And some of them were literally thousands of pages of material. So when you think about how complex that is and how there are overlapping regulatory requirements that both guide and prescribe what we do, slight errors and mistakes can do an application. It's very intense and it's very meticulous. So that's what I would do is I would put together these funding proposals, submit them, and if the deals got awarded, then I would take deals through entitlement, through design and construction, into construction. At times, I would oversee construction. More often, though, I would hand off to a counterpart if I was in a larger organization. And then with the tax credit deals, a delay can be very detrimental because you have sold credits to an investor and they expect the delivery of those units to deliver them credits along a certain timeline. If you are late on that, the value of the credits decreases.
And Brian, I want to make sure I take some time to ask you, is there a simple way to explain what low-income housing tax credits are? Let's start with a very basic understanding. What's your simple way? Like, how would you explain this to your kids? Like, what are low-income housing tax credits?
So they are credits that offset the tax liabilities of corporate entities. Initially, back in the day, and I think you can still do this, although it doesn't really happen or work, but anyone could invest in these. You and I could buy credits in a deal and apply them to tax liability. But these are almost always large banks, insurance companies, institutional investors, and they buy the credits to offset tax liability over time. There is a piece of legislation called the Community Reinvestment Act that requires them, particularly banks, to invest in certain communities where they have deposits. And so credits in one city will be more valuable to one investor versus another, right? But basically, if you boil it down, you are trading a tax incentive for cash equity in a deal. And it's really been the most successful public-private partnership in respect to housing in our country's history, right? It is unilaterally supported on both sides of the aisle. There's never an argument about it.
That's such a great way to explain it. I love how you use the analogy of using future money, in this case, the tax credits, turning them into cash so that you can use them for the project today to meet your equity requirements on a capital stack.
Yeah.
And earlier you talked about understanding what a deal looks like, right? Assessing the deal. If you were to teach someone how to look at a project and say, hey, might this qualify, or might this project score enough points for me to get the low-income housing tax credits awarded for this project? Like, how do you even go about teaching someone, hey, what should they go first? Should they go look at the qualified allocation plan first? What are your thoughts? How do you teach folks?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I do teach this to a lot of different people in organizations who are interested in this work. Every funding source has criteria that the award of it is based upon, right? There are point systems, there are policy requirements. I guess it's sort of a deductive process. You read what's called a qualified allocation plan, which is each state's guiding document. It will tell you exactly what they want to fund, and then you respond to it. But when you're layering gap financing on top of the tax credit equity, there then come additional requirements. So like here in Tennessee, the requirements of the state agency are very flexible. But if you need money from a municipal jurisdiction, then you're really going to drill down to what policies or priorities that city or county promotes.
That's interesting. So if, let's say, someone gets a project, right? They're like, I got this raw piece of dirt and I want to build affordable housing. Do you suggest them look up the zoning and that stuff first? Or do you suggest them going directly to the QAP and seeing whether or not they might even score enough points, and then coming up with a business plan that helps them achieve and score the most points, I guess, for lack of better words?
Yeah, I think the way I've always approached it is understand what the funders want first. Because if you're not responding to their needs, and you're not being that type of partner, you're not going to get the financing, right? So say you're evaluating a number of sites that meet criteria that a state agency or a city want to fund. Then, of course, things like whether they're appropriately zoned, what sort of entitlement process you have to go through. Are there environmental concerns with the site? Can I clear trees, or do I have to preserve them? What sort of regulation are going to impose the ability to develop the asset? And it's pretty common to have to rezone. It's pretty common to have to clean up dirt, right? But that adds time and cost. So there's an evaluation process there. And sometimes with things like rezoning, you run into neighbors who are not really happy with what you're proposing. And then the political and the community process becomes very integral to the success of the development.
I love that. That was such a great lead in there, Brian, because not only did you cover about how to approach a project, right? Obviously, if someone looks at a piece of land and they say, hey, it's not zoned for that, that's not a deal breaker. Right. But you have to understand you can get it rezoned, but you have to give the city or county what they want. And that goes all the way from the state all the way down to the city and county level, because I think development is a very steep hill to climb. And if you can make it any less steep at any point in time, that might be a good idea to avoid some brain damage. Now, Brian, you talked about getting the neighbors involved, right? Getting their buy-in. Tell me a little bit about the right or wrong way of going about getting a project approved. Like, is there such a thing as a wrong way to go about it based on your experience and what you've seen?
To go about it. One of the egoic faults of developers, one of the common ones, is that you fall in love with your project, you invest so much in the concept that you think it's the greatest deal ever, right? Well, you're the only one who thinks that, by and large. And so you can never walk into a public meeting or talk to an elected official and have that presumption. Because what that conveys is an arrogance, whether you are arrogant about it or not, right? You want to convey belief in what you're doing, and you want them to understand what you're trying to do and also to believe in it, but you have to see it from their angle as well. Elected officials are responsible for their constituents. They have to respond to them. Communities are neighborhoods. These are people who have lived in an area, that have businesses in an area, their kids go to school in an area. And with any type of development, there's often fear. What are the negative externalities that this could bring? And in affordable housing, there's a lot of stigma, right? A lot of people think old 1960s vintage HUD housing, public housing that was never really kept well. They think that it brings problems in terms of crime or other things associated with poverty. And the education component becomes really important, because a lot of those suspicions are myths. But you're never going to get to the table with anyone and get them to listen if you try and shove it down their throat. And probably the second biggest mistake I see is when a developer gets up and tries to act like, I'm one of you, right? You're not one of them. You're standing on the other side of the line because you need their approval. And so humility is an essential ingredient to gaining trust. I like to joke a lot. I'm very self-deprecating, and I think that puts people at ease. And I don't take myself too seriously. And when they can see that, then they let their guard down enough to have a conversation. Once you have the conversation going, the data is very important. You need to show and prove to them that this is not going to bring all these ancillary evils with it, right? It's actually going to improve the quality of life in your community.
And I love how you address that elephant in a room where you say, hey, I am not one of you. I am on the other side. And that level of authenticity goes a long way because put yourself in the shoes of the audience, of the community members. They're like, this guy, we don't need this project. Why are you telling us what we need, right? You're not one of us. And that's what I realized in development. It's so much about understanding what everybody else wants, because if you can get everybody what they want, chances are you can get what you want.
You're never going to please everyone, though, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, Brian, because this is good, right? This is the most important part when we make it concrete, because everyone's like, oh, you're going to get pushback. Can you tell us about a time when you had a challenging process to get a project approved, and how might you have overcome that?
Yeah, I've got a lot of this. I'll start with a vignette. I sort of learned the importance of psychology and understanding the dialect of who you're talking to, because having developed housing in multiple states, there's differences, right? And early in my career, after Hurricane Katrina, I was working for a company that, like others, wanted to get into the game in Louisiana because there was a ton of federal money, disaster relief money coming. And so the first probably 2 or 3 times I flew from Ohio to Baton Rouge in New Orleans, I couldn't get people to acknowledge me at all. And we had sort of a dress code. So I was wearing like a charcoal gray or dark blue suit and trying to look very professional. And one plane flight back, it sort of dawned on me that I didn't look the part of someone in New Orleans. So I went and I bought a powder blue pinstripe seersucker suit, a bright yellow shirt and tie, and cream-colored alligator shoes. And I wore that the next time I was in New Orleans. And people were like, where have you been all our lives, right? And it was such a moment, an epiphany of like, wow, I need to respect the dialect here. I need to respect the culture. I need to understand that. I don't have the cultural awareness of what's important to the people of New Orleans, right? And so I carried that lesson with me everywhere I've gone, everywhere I've developed. Specific deals, supportive housing is a very complex type of housing to make work. And when you're going into a neighborhood and saying, hey, I want to bring 70 units of chronically homeless people with persistent mental disability. These might be veterans who have PSTD. They might be people who have addiction issues or just have mental illness in general. That's not popular, right? You can imagine the reaction that I would often get. And I did this. I think I developed 4 buildings during my time with that nonprofit and approached probably a dozen different council wards in the city of Cleveland. There was only once that I didn't win over the community. But at the start of each one, the constituents were not in favor. And so what we would do is, first of all, you have to show them that, hey, you're thinking affordable, you're thinking brick barracks, right? Old public housing. That's not what we're building. What we're building has to look and function as well or better than high-end market rate housing. The people who live there have to be proud of it because they've been living on the streets and in shelters. It has to change their psychology. So we would bring people from one neighborhood to one of our buildings and another so they could see firsthand. And then we would show them how, hey, if you were on this street 5 years ago before our building was here, there were a lot of decaying porches and unkept yards, but they're not anymore because we brought this and suddenly the neighbors began to take pride. Then in supportive housing is a different sort of messaging in terms of how it's operated. That's very critical, more so than in other types of affordable housing. But what ultimately won the day was the math. At the time, this is like 2010, 11, 12, 13, in Northeast Ohio, a chronically homeless individual was costing the taxpayer about $26,000, $27,000 a year, if I recall, in emergency services, shelter stays, a psychiatric hospital, it's emergency room visits, whatever sort of safety nets existed to provide for these people. That's how much it was costing. But I could house them, operate a building, and provide the necessary services on site to keep them, to provide the stability they needed for $15,000 a year in taxpayer money. And that delta, we could show people, we closed down a shelter in Cleveland because it wasn't needed anymore. Right? We were housing enough of the chronically homeless where that shelter didn't need to operate. And when you get past people's fear or their prejudice, and prejudice is rooted in fear, I think, you can introduce the human element, right? And we used to say this all the time, like maybe you're afraid of homelessness, but think about it, someone. You have a family member or a friend of a friend that has experienced this, right? And even here in Tennessee, when I moved here in 2021, the state legislature passed a law that made it a felony offense to put a tent on public property because there was tremendous amount of fear over the homeless populations in the large metro areas sort of expanding out, creeping out. That's changed though. That's begun to change because what's happening is everyone, elected officials are understanding that poverty is everywhere, addiction is everywhere, homelessness, it touches every corner of the state, it touches every state in the country. It's everyone's problem. And when they understand that, the human element can begin to take over the conversation.
Yeah. And I love how you got through the first level of the psychology layer, right? Where it's the fear. Hey, I don't want this in my neighborhood. I don't want those people in my neighborhood. They're going to cause troubles. They're going to cause crime, et cetera, et cetera. But you showed them with actual examples of how people have, one, been successful in this program, two, actually increase or uplift the general facade of the entire neighborhood because people had more pride and dignity in where they lived. And I think that was so crucial for you to overcome and show what's in it for them too. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's not, that wasn't the primary reason, but showing what's in it for them and then supporting with some math behind it where it's much lower cost to support a homeless person if we're housing them at one of our units. That seemed great because now you're addressing the residents' perspective, but then you're also addressing the city council's perspective because they have to fund all the homelessness support. This is so good. And in order for permanent supportive housing to work, right, what have you seen in terms of services that are actually effective? Because there's one thing to say like, hey, we need one social worker for every two people or something like that, right? But what have you seen that actually works? Because I think this is such a strong and much needed topic that needs to be discussed today because people need to learn from you on what worked.
Yeah. So with the population, the chronically homeless population that we were serving in Northeast Ohio, generally, I think we had one full-time case manager for every, say, 12 to 15 residents. And so typical buildings, 60 to 70 units, you'd have about 4, 5 full-time case managers, right? And then there would be one sort of manager of those case managers who would sort of understand the whole population of the building. They all have, they really have to be sort of cross-trained in a number of disciplines because no two people have the same set of circumstances or the same challenges, right? And that's sort of the first safety net. But chronically homeless also typically don't have jobs. Their only income might be Social Security, or they may not even be receiving it. So we would have an employment specialist who would start at the very basic, like, let's get you up for disability or let's set you up for Social Security. And if you are interested in working and you are stabilized enough to step out and do that, then this person would help them find employers who had the need to hire them and would hire them, but they also would work with the employers to understand the needs of the individual, right? And so there was a liaison between employer and resident of our building who wanted to work. We often had, in fact, I think the service provider was called Frontline at the time. I don't know if they've changed their name, rebranded, but they got a grant from the state of Ohio to basically operate a mobile health clinic that could come to our buildings, right? And the issue was a lot of these residents, if they had to get on a bus and make more than one bus line change, it was really difficult for them to get to a destination. It was terrifying. So we were bringing healthcare to the buildings where there was more comfort and more confidence in the residents utilizing it. Property management is very critical as well because you have to understand the population. And people think like, oh, the homeless are going to come and they're going to bring crime. The way that actually works is that the crime preys on them. So the dope dealers, the pimps, the people who prey on the most vulnerable, if they know that there's 70 of these residents in the building, you better believe that they're going to come to that block. So we had 24-hour, 7-day-a-week front desk security. Buildings were all highly secured and cameras going up and down the block, every conceivable angle. That kept those negative elements away. But what it also did was every time there was a traffic accident or maybe there was a mugging or something like that, district police were using our tape to help them figure out what went on or to create a case. So they were in our buildings. Well, inevitably, the residents start talking to the officers. And then suddenly we're holding district police meetings in our buildings in the community room. And then you have something that didn't exist before, and that is trust between this population and those who are supposed to serve and protect it, right? And so there are a lot of elements to how the buildings function or operate. And I will tell you, if you do not have a property manager with requisite experience for that population, if you do not have a really strong service provider, you're in trouble.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing all the elements that's required to work. And I think some of the hardest problems to solve in the world, they don't have shortcuts, right? And I think this is a perfect example of, it's not something that you just throw money at. It's something that you have to throw money at and provide supportive services. And in this case, it was, I caught into a couple of things, right? Case managers, you had one-on-one support. You had medical services coming to you on site. And then you had great property manager along with 24/7 security that allowed you to preserve the safe environment for your residences, but then also kind of dismantle and debunk that myth about it's going to bring a lot of crime. In fact, you probably lowered crime because probably everyone's staying away from that building. They're like, I don't want any trouble with that building because I know I'm going to get caught. It makes so much sense. But when you boil it down to it, it's like, oh, this seems like common sense. Why didn't we put more resources on that and make sure that we're thinking about all these elements? And that's why I was so excited to bring you on to the call today, Brian. It's like everybody talks about this homelessness problem. Well, why don't you go ask people that have had success with this? We can share all this information very widely across the entire country. Now, does the magnitude of problem differ, right, from one area to another? Yes. I'm not saying everybody's situation is very different, but at least you could take elements of what has worked and try to replicate some of that.
Yeah, and I think some areas, some of the really large cities, New York or LA, their homelessness problem is just so enormous that they can't address it as well as maybe a smaller market that has a more finite number of unhoused people. But what's really exciting too, so PSH is new to Tennessee in some respects. It has not been an established or proven model here, but the state and local governments are very interested in promoting it now and seeing it happen. And you think it's not just your typical thought of what a homeless person is, someone shuffling around on the street. It can be someone escaping domestic violence. They don't have a home, so they can't go back to that home, right? It can be a youth aging out of foster care. There's nowhere to go. And I'm really lucky and fortunate. I'm on the board of a local nonprofit called I Am Next, who just got a very significant funding award from Metro government to basically provide, I think it's 60 efficiency units for youth aging out of foster care.
Wow, that's so cool.
Oh, and you think about like a lot of them in Tennessee, the process to get a driver's license is more complicated than I remember it being in Ohio. and these kids, because they're in the system, they don't get the necessary educational components, and that window closes on them. Well, if you age out of foster care and you can't get a driver's license, it makes getting a job a lot harder, which makes paying rent harder, right? I mean, these are often the next wave of homeless that are coming through the system. And this nonprofit is really, I think, charging full steam ahead to say, hey, we can fix this. We can do something about it. And so it's on the forefront here, and it's exciting to see it happen and be part of it.
Wow. That's such amazing news. And it's so heartwarming. Well, Brian, maybe you can share a story. Do you have any stories of people that maybe you personally knew or personally witnessed where permanent supportive housing has sort of changed their lives? I want people to just understand like this is a very human business, and if they can get a little inspired by your story, I really want them to hear it. Yeah,
the first development that I placed in service was called Greenbridge Commons. It was a 70-unit permanent supportive housing deal in Cleveland. Beautiful, beautiful building. And I don't remember the resident's name anymore, but there was a man who had been homeless for essentially 2 decades, right? And he lived in a tent somewhere in the city. And so when we were able to move him into the building, he brought his tent with him, and he set it up in a single room occupancy building, right? So, or a unit. He set up his tent in the middle of the room, and that's where he would sleep because that's what he knew. That was his comfort, right? And maybe about 2 or 3 months after we'd opened the building and moved everyone in, the property manager called me and she said, Brian, he threw out his tent today. Wow. That was the moment. And that's when I knew that this is the only way I ever wanted to do housing, regardless of supportive housing or senior housing or just family housing. But there has to be, the housing was the foundation, right? Clean, sanitary, healthy housing changes outcomes. But there have to be things too that open trajectories for people, because otherwise the cycle of poverty continues, right?
Brian, I'm so grateful that you came on the podcast today. I really wanted people to hear that story. And I think there's so many people listening right now. And the reason why a lot of people listen to this pod is because they want to make a difference with their time, their energy, their resources. And if you were looking for a reason today and you were listening today, I really hope that story resonated with you. Someone that's been homeless for 2 decades. even when they got that home, it takes that much amount of change and that much amount of time for 2, 3 months before they gave up their tent.
Yeah.
And it shows how deeply rooted homelessness can be in someone's life and how hard it is to get out of that.
Yeah.
And I hope everybody really listens to Brian today and understand, hey, what does it take to end homelessness in an area? What services do you need to support those folks? And then decide that's something that you're interested in. I guarantee there's one person listening today that's going to say, what? That's what I want to do. That's exactly the type of person I want to help. Brian's exactly the person I want to learn from because he did everything right. And he showed you, hey, yeah, you're going to get some opposition from the neighbors. Yeah. But he also told you how you can overcome that. It's not 100%. No one bats 1,000. But Brian gave you some really great examples and really great approaches on how to approach that conversation. Wow.
Yeah.
Brian.
And like I said, it really applies to development in general. Like, I think you should have that approach, right? 'Cause you think about it, the tax laws that govern these housing credit deals, you're in it, or an owner is in it for a long term, right? Typically it's 30 or more years in any given state. You're a neighbor. You're part of a community, right? And you need to understand that, and you need to respect that, and you need to treat your presence there as both a privilege and an obligation, right?
Absolutely, Brian. And we talked a little bit earlier about low-income housing tax credits. You talked a little bit about grants. And I'm not sure if this is the right question for you, but do you have experience like getting awarded grants? And if someone's out there trying to get a grant, right, to help whatever cause they want, do you have any general advice on how they should approach that grant writing process and any kind of lessons that you can share with them?
Well, it always seems like these things come down to the deadline wires, right? No matter how good your intentions are at getting things done early, but be prepared, start early, have the conversations that you need to have early. Don't just expect if you come and you need something last minute, like I need a support letter from a council member. Don't ask for that a week before you have to submit an application. They should know about your project months ahead of time. They should have the opportunity to ask questions, to convey information back to their community. You should engage the community. In terms of the nuts and bolts of the application, it's very detail oriented. You just got to pay attention to details. Ask questions to the funders. And there's so many different specialties within this world, right? I mean, I've been doing it for a long time, but there are still circumstances where, okay, I've got a building that has a half story on it and it's 4 stories everywhere else, but does that half story make it a 5-story building on that end? And therefore, do my Davis-Bacon wage rates that come with HUD money go from the residential wage rate, which I can afford, or go to the 5-story construction wage rate, which I cannot afford, right? So I got to go find someone who knows Davis-Bacon like the back of their hand, right? Because the time it would take me to derive a conclusion is not well spent, right? I want that expert. And so acknowledge what you don't know and figure out where to get those answers and who to involve. And honestly, you're submitting an application, it's a moment in time, right? You've presented something, then you wait. One of the mistakes that I've seen developers make is that you don't acknowledge you don't want to spend a lot of money during that waiting period. Sometimes you have to because of the requirements for when you close the deal. But make sure that you are aligning everything, right? I am a big advocate of having local partnerships in place, right? And laying that groundwork ahead of time so that you're not then sprinting and knocking on everyone's door the day after you get your funding award saying, hey, this needs to happen now. Have people who know the local rules, who have the context, who understand the community. And this goes the architect, engineering team, whatever consultants you bring in.
Wow. And I love all those lessons that you just talked about. I mean, just early preparedness, attention to details, learn to build those relationships well and far in advance before you might actually need to call upon them to help you with your project. Yeah. I mean, you got to learn how to pitch and you got to learn how to talk about your project in a way that appeases to more folks. And Brian, this is a very personal question because I think I told you about this, right? We want to make sure we're passing down the right skills and the lessons to our kids. I mean, is there anything from like development, just general life lessons that you've taken that you think is like really important to pass on to the next generation? Like if you were to give like a couple lessons to your kids and it's like your last day on earth, like what would you tell them?
There are a lot of things I would say, and a lot of them probably sound like cliches, like persistence is important and believing in the mission is important, et cetera. But when I first moved to Tennessee, I struck up a relationship with a real estate broker, and he didn't know anything about affordable, but as I was explaining to him what I was looking for in sites, he got very curious. And so we'd had a lot of conversations about what this is and how you do it. And one day he said, I want to do that myself. And I said, that's great. And he goes, yeah, I want to drive down the street and see my name on a building. And I said, no, you don't. You got to get past that. because this is a service that we are providing and you are a servant of it. It's not your name. It's okay to say, that's my building. I developed that. It's okay to take pride in doing a job well, but do not have pride in the job you've done.
That's such a great lesson. And one of the most profound lessons that I learned when I was starting this podcast, Brian, is I had a lot of imposter syndrome. I literally thought, hey, why would people want to listen to me? Right. I started this podcast before I ever got into affordable housing, to be honest with you. But I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to get in this space. I wanted to learn from people that are successful in this space. And my daughter still always listen to this someday, right? I want you to understand that no one cares about who you are. Like, they care about what you can do for them. And when you take immense gratitude and fulfillment from serving others, that's when you take actually all the pressure off of yourself. And I think that was a really great lesson that I learned personally in my life, especially with this podcast, where my goal is simple, Brian. I want to bring you on. I want to share your knowledge with the world. But most importantly, I want to thank you, Brian, because seriously, without people like you, I would have never had the home I grew up in. Never. Yeah. And I'm so grateful for people like you, that people have that heart. It's just so refreshing to have a little bit of faith in humanity, that there are great people out there. You just got to look for them. And if you believe there are great people, chances are you're going to find those people a little bit easier.
Yeah, I agree with that. And one of the things that I really hope to see in my career, my time doing this, is the message. And I'm not the only one preaching it, obviously. There are a lot of people who will tell you the exact same stuff I've said today. But I want more people saying it, more people doing it, because it will cause the resources to manifest. If you have a loud enough voice and enough people asking, right, demanding the change. One of I guess the realities of this is that poverty is sort of, in some senses, a relative thing, right? What qualifies a household for low-income tax-credit housing in Nashville, Tennessee, that income level does not qualify them for low-income housing, say, in Biloxi, Mississippi. They're doing pretty well at that salary level or whatever, that earning level, in a different market. So it's a relative thing. Here in Nashville, we have an immense affordable problem, but we also have an immense sort of middle income problem, like where the people who are really the backbones of the economy maybe make too much money to qualify for tax credit housing, but they still can't afford to live here. So it's very complex, it's very big, and there are a lot of different solutions that can address components of it. But in some sense, it's always going to be with us, right? Because it is relative.
Absolutely. And I think it's just so important for you to identify who do you want to help and how do you want to help them. Personally, I mean, we chose housing. We thought that housing is at its foundation, the most important element, because if you don't have a stable home, it's very hard for your mind to be ready to take on new responsibilities, take on new adventures, and sometimes take on new feelings of discomfort in order for you to progress and grow, because there's discomfort every time you decide to grow, every time you decide to do something new. And I really hope that all of our children listen to this podcast. They understand, like, hey, when you're comfortable, that means chances are you're on the right path. Mm-hmm. And if you're still a little nervous, go find other people that are doing the thing that you want to learn. And if you want to grow up and, I don't know, be a guitarist, I was like, don't ask me for advice. Go find someone that's actually like a very famous guitarist that's actually been through it, because I don't think I can give them the right advice. And I'm so grateful for people like you, Brian, because I wanted to be a developer and I never knew how I could even start. And you were so kind, you were so generous with your time, and you took the time to jump on a call with me with a complete stranger you met on the internet and really pour into us as a community. So, Brian, I'm so grateful for you. Thank you so much for coming out to the podcast.
My gratitude goes to you, because I love talking about this, right? I mean, I think you probably get the sense that I carry a soapbox with me, that I'll get up on it at every opportunity, but just the opportunity to reach people. Like you said, maybe there's someone out there that hears something in this conversation and it changes their direction. I think I told you this story. It's on my bucket list, my affordable housing bucket list, but I live in a market with an NHL team, right? And both my sons are travel hockey players, and there's a period where I was doing some private consulting in Cleveland, and so I was working from home, and summer break was miserable because I had two little kids who were just constantly fighting with each other and bothering me. And so I'd take them to the ice rink and open skate and just throw them out there and sit there on my laptop. And one day it was just my older son, and he was out there, he was the only person on the ice. And then a busload of kids from a Baptist church camp came in, and they got rental skates. And I watched them for a few minutes, and you could just tell none of them had ever skated. Like, they had no experience whatsoever. And one of his buddies from school was in this camp. So he's talking to his buddy, and next thing I know, there are 20 kids lined up on the goal line. He's teaching them how to do hockey starts and stops, goal line to blue line and back. And I thought, man, what if one of these kids goes home and says to their parents, I want to play hockey, right? A sport they were not a traditional sport for them, not something that they were exposed to, and a lot of stigma around it. And so when I moved here, I said, what? I'm in an NHL market. I'm going to, at some point, have a program that brings hockey to affordable housing residents who otherwise may never know a thing about it, because maybe it changes someone's outlook. And if it does that for one person and everyone else has a lot of fun, it's a good thing.
That's so freaking cool, man. I hope someone from the NHL or in Nashville hears this podcast someday and says, yeah, I want to do that. We'll bring the kids out. We'll have some fun with them. And I guarantee those kids' lives will be changed. If not growing up to be an NHL player, but at least they will remember that experience of learning something new. And I bet that experience will stay with them forever. Well, Brian, we're getting to the end of the podcast, and I want to ask you a question I ask everybody. This is, why do you think affordable housing, particularly the lack of supply of affordable housing, is just so hard to solve for? No right or wrong answers.
Yeah, there's not. I think part of it goes back to what I was talking about when I said poverty is sort of a relative thing, right? There will always be comparative factors that designate someone as living below a certain income threshold that prevents them from having access to things that the rest of the population considers normal or part of everyday life. In the foreclosure crisis, 2007, 2008, I remember thinking at the time the price of gasoline had gone through the roof. And you had a whole percentage of renters or maybe mortgagees, whatever, that were probably living paycheck to paycheck, right? Making ends meet, stable, but barely. And suddenly, if they're spending $200 more on gas in a month, that could tip the balance, right? It can be very subtle but complex economic realities that make it so hard. Here in Nashville, just extreme population growth over the last decade or more has caused housing prices to go through the roof. Everyone wants to move here, be part of the culture, Sunbelt, et cetera. It's made it a lot harder for a lot of people to maintain or find housing, right? And that's just an economic reality. I think that I wish that we would commit more of our resources to this. I'm trying to think I'll remember this in a minute we get off this call, but I listen to a lot of rap music, and there's this phrase that keeps coming to my head. The MC said we wish the government would build schools instead of jails, right? More schools, less jails, right? Liberate people through education, and you won't need the jails. And so there are a number of factors that lead to the problem, and probably fewer factors that contribute to the solution. And maybe that's ultimately the imbalance that we were struggling with.
Wow, that is just such beautifully said. I mean, people have told me like, hey, you can't solve affordable housing. And I know that's not true. Eventually, with every guest that comes on a podcast, they have a little different perspective, a little different idea. And I view everybody that comes on this podcast as a piece of the puzzle. And I'm so glad you're part of the puzzle that we're solving today, Brian, because you're actively doing it. You helped a ton of folks dealing with chronic homelessness. I'm so grateful you came onto the podcast again today. I mean, do you have any parting words for the audience today based on all your lessons that you want to share with them?
Yeah, whatever. I think ultimately our job in life, right, in choosing a career and following it, is to find what we do well, what we love and are passionate about, and then through that activity to radiate to the rest of the world. And if you're doing that, you are making the world a better place. No one may remember you after you're gone. That's not important. But if you pass that spark on to someone, eventually it's going to catch fire. And I did remember the rap group. It's called Marzil. They're out of Atlanta. If you don't know them, check them out. They're really good.
Nice. We could not have ended this podcast on a better note. Thank you so much for sharing your lessons, Brian. And hopefully I can bring you back on a podcast in a future episode. Maybe we can dive deeper into some projects that you're doing, and we can use some very tactical, tangible examples of projects that you're working on and share that with the audience today. But I think you give some amazing nuggets today. So thank you so much, Brian. Appreciate you so much.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Anytime. I'd love to come back.
Yeah. And Brian, for anyone that wants to follow you or get in touch with you, where can they find out more about you, man?
The only social media I'm on is LinkedIn, so they can find me there.
All right. Everybody, go follow Brian Drobnick. Please do. Blow his messages up, but only if it's like legitimate questions. All right. All right. Thank you so much, Brian. And we are out.